space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life, new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. I know it's a little bit of a stretch to call that a classic American literature. But unless you've been living under a rock for about the past 60 years, you recognize that as the opening monologue to Star Trek. There she is, Starship Enterprise. Now I'm talking about the original Star Trek here, the one from the 60s, one that in my opinion is the real Star Trek, but that's another discussion for another time for all you Trekkies. But what might you be asking, does this have to do with the current sermon series, Making Disciples? And that's a fair question. What in the world does this have to do with that? But if you bear with me for a little bit, let's see where this takes us. So in Star Trek, the Enterprise was part of what was known as Starfleet. In the Starfleet manual, there exists a list of regulations. Starfleet Regulation number 1, also known as the Prime Directive, states that Starfleet crews, when encountering civilizations on any alien planet that is not yet as advanced as that of Earth, should not interfere with said civilization so as not to in any way affect the natural advancement of that civilization. That seems like a pretty sound philosophy. Only thing is, at about every episode they interfered a lot. Without that, there'd be no show, right? As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we have our own manual, and it's right here. In it, we also have a prime directive, but we call it the Great Commission. And making disciples is, in large part, our prime directive. Go with me now to Matthew 18, beginning with verse 19. We should know this by heart by now because Pastor's repeated it several times over the past few weeks, but let's look at it again. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. That is our prime directive, the Great Commission. And actually, it's quite the opposite of Starfleet's prime directive, where they were instructed not to interfere. We are, in essence, commanded to interfere, interact, and intercept Satan's influence and the influence of those in our culture who would lead us away from Jesus. Pretty basic, pretty simple. Well, I wish it was that simple. Just like Starfleet, quite often it seems, we do just the opposite. Or we don't quite do what we should. We miss opportunities. And so it brings us to the title of today's message, The Great Omission. Omission is defined as to omit, to overlook, to leave out, or to neglect. Sometimes it seems like we try and make the Great Commission greater. And in so doing, we make a great mistake. We do something that you may remember me saying before from this very platform. We miss the forest for the trees. By trying to make something noticeably greater, more so than it already is in its natural state, we endeavor beyond the simple command and we try to make it bigger, selfie-worthy, attention-grabbing. And in doing so, in many ways, we are violating the very heart of the prime directive of Jesus, to go and make disciples. We are so caught up in the detailed minutiae of the literal interpretation of what Jesus is commanding that we miss the obvious. We miss opportunities. We overlook helping those who need us the most. We miss the forest for the trees. We omit, we leave out, we overlook, and we neglect those with the greatest need and potential to become disciples. We seek out civilizations at a far distance instead of taking note of what's right in front of us. We commit their great omission. In Star Trek, the prime directive was designed so as not to do anything to unduly influence the natural advancement of that civilization and culture. We are to do the opposite. We are to advance the kingdom of God by interfering with civilization and culture, by bringing the gospel and the good news to the world. It's the first phase of making disciples. This is not best accomplished by mere addition. It's best accomplished by multiplication. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and so on. And eventually, more disciples. Now, that's less about quantity than it is about quality. Big impacts are definitely noticed and can bring about great results. There's no doubt of that. In the wide, wide world of social media, posts about where we went, what we did, and even who we helped may indeed have their impact. But who or what might we be neglecting in the process? Motivation is important. Pastor mentioned that word last Sunday, motivation. It is important. Discipling is not about highlighting our accomplishments, it's about making followers of Jesus. It must be honoring of Jesus' command. Take a look at this picture. Picture of a large stone hitting water with a major impact. The resulting splash is big, makes a lot of noise, it attracts attention. We snap our heads when we hear the stone slap the water. Then the waves the impact creates travel outward from the epicenter of the impact and travel far out into the pond. And they last quite a while in a very visible way. Big impact. Now take a look at this photo. This is a photo of a pebble that's been tossed into the same pond. It makes very little noise. Just bloop. Let me do that again so you got it. Bloop. Very little impact. Probably goes unnoticed. And there are no noticeable waves, just little ripples. They're much smaller and seem to disappear, but they don't. They continue outward, away from the point of impact. You just can't see them, but they're there. They reach just as far. Now let me ask you a question. Who made a bigger impact on history? Abraham Lincoln or his mom and dad? Abe was the big stone that splashed into the pond. Everybody noticed it. Pretty much became the greatest president we've ever had. His parents, just a little bloop that no one noticed for quite a while. Abe was a big impact in the pond of history. His parents merely gave birth to him. But that little bloop in the water created tiny ripples that traveled out across the water and were eventually multiplied to the impact of the man, as I said, arguably became the greatest president. Small impacts can yield incredible results. That's what multiplication looks like. Let's take a look at Mark 12, beginning with verse 41. We've heard this passage many, many times over the years. In fact, from this very platform, and I've used it before, but it's so impactful in what it has to say. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." There is in this passage so much to learn, even in the present context of this morning's message. The 2 coins she dropped in the offering were very insignificant, not just in value, but in size. Some historians say that they were so light in weight that if you dropped them, they'd flutter before they hit the ground. In other words, they made no sound or impact when they hit the offering tray. Much like the pebble dropped in the water, made very little sound. But the impact of her action has been so great that it was noticed by Jesus. And he told his disciples, and they, in essence, told us. And it's still being told today. Those little coins may have made only a tiny clink when they landed, but the reverberations of what she did still echo today when that passage is read in churches across the world. That's what multiplication looks like. As I said earlier, last week Pastor Joseph mentioned a very important word, motivation. We must be motivated with pure intentions when we set out to reach the lost, teach them and make them into disciples. Well, we want to let our light shine for others and not be hidden under a basket. We also should be moved to do what we do for the right reason. That light should not be turned into a spotlight back on ourselves, but it should illuminate what it means to make a disciple and be a disciple. Seeking attention in and of itself is not a worthy motivation. That's self-serving. Selfies and social media posts should be done in proper context. Keeping a tally and comparing successes to others is not a worthy endeavor here. God is not interested in counting anything. Contest and competition do not belong in evangelizing or in the making of disciples. That's being like the folks who threw in large amounts into the temple treasury in order to draw attention to themselves. But doing so to show others what disciples look like is a worthy motivation. Quality means everything. As I said, I really like to bring the word to life and demonstrate it in the real world with real people, some of whom we know. So, around 16 years ago, my wife and I were invited to join a Connect group at the church we were part of at that time. That group consisted of 5 couples. We were all in the same phase of life, raising children, balancing work life with home life, etc. The couple that started and led that group are still friends today. In fact, they're in-laws, so we kind of have to be friends. Our oldest son and their daughter were in the 4th grade at that time. The 2 of them met while that Connect group was active. Those 2 kids were married a few years ago. The couple who began that group met in college, married, and started navigating through life without being a part of a church. Then they had children, and like most of us, their eyes were opened. And they knew something was missing. So they began attending a church, became a part of a Connect group where a seed was planted. After relocating to Council Bluffs, they found a home church and felt called to start a new Connect group. That's the group my wife and I became a part of. There were seeds that were planted and germinated and grew up, and in turn planted new seeds. Multiplication. We all provided that to one another. All 5 of us couples grew and became not just close, but better disciples. And now we're all part of other churches, which is fine, where we all reach out and are making disciples. Multiplication. Wherever you are, Dave and Lynette, thank you. What that group did was create a ripple. Evangelism and making disciples. And it still continues, because in addition to that, 3 or 4 of those original couples still meet often for dinner and coffee. Kristen and I find ourselves blessed to still have a connection with those couples. Another of those couples that we still have a connection with is also here today. They told me a story that I just have to let you hear, and they gave me permission to tell it. Many years ago, still early on in their marriage, A woman who lived across the street from them kept being urged by God to go across the street. Just go across the street and introduce yourself. Her name is Brenda. So Brenda decided to go across the street and introduce herself. But she did a bit more than that. She told them that God laid it upon her heart that she should go over and invite them to church, and so she did. Recently, they introduced us to Brenda. Remarkably, we discovered that she graduated with Kristen. Incidentally, she also is the same Brenda who sang at our wedding. Small world. But that's not the remarkable part about this story. That couple that was in our group, they now head up a very special ministry outreach at their church. Every October, City Light West, which is about a mile and a half from here, they hand out over 1,000 hot dogs to people who come to their church's trunk or treat. They lead this effort and are so invested in it that they arranged with the local grocery chain, Fairway, to donate 1,100 hot dogs and 1,100 hot dog buns, no charge. That little distance Brenda decided to go across the street was a ripple that's still going today. In fact, the couple told me that if just one child starts attending church, then that may be all it takes. A seed planted, possibly germinated, evangelism and discipleship, multiplication. That's what it looks like. Thank you, Todd and Monica. Now, making disciples is a journey. The road is long. Take a look at this picture here. I love this picture because it shows a hiking path. And you may have heard me say before, my wife and I love to hike in the mountains in Colorado. Sometimes it's a good idea when you're in the mountains of Colorado to know where you're going. Because if you don't, you can get in trouble really quick. The weather changes fast in the mountains. As you can see, this path divides into the proverbial fork in the road. At Saylorville Church, north of Des Moines, lead pastor Pat Nemmers has a favorite saying, and that is, paths lead to places. Similarly, all roads lead somewhere, or one of my favorites, way leads on to way. Now, let me ask you, what do you notice about both of these paths? Anybody? You can't see where they go. They disappear in the distance. And that's okay. Not knowing for sure is part of the challenge, the mystery. It requires a little bit of faith and trust. But now look at this one here. Look at this next picture. Here it comes. Wayfinding sign. It tells you where you're going. It tells you what to expect. Signage that shows the way. It clearly tells us what leads where. This is the benefit, one of the benefits of knowing Jesus. We know which way he wants us to go. Doesn't mean that we always choose to. Doesn't mean that the terrain will be easy, but it is the right way. Now look at this picture. This is a different perspective of the fork in the road. Two paths that converge. While it's true that paths lead to places and all roads lead somewhere, it's also true that everyone came from some place and from somewhere. Everyone here today has been on a journey that has brought you to this place in this moment. Everything you are has been determined by your path up to this point. Sometimes our paths converge. Joe and Karen Skinner have been on a journey. The long and winding road, to use one of my favorite song titles. Their individual experience converged when they met along the way. That journey led them here to Crossroads, and for many years, they led the Overcomers Ministry. I have no idea how many lives they've impacted and how many seeds they planted. Again, quantity is not so important, but I dare say it's a pretty darn good quality crop. They decided to go and sow seeds. Now, Joe and Karen have decided to step back and release a new couple who they taught and discipled to lead from here on. They made some disciples. Jason and Tammy Sprinkle are the new leaders of Overcomers here at Crossroads. Their paths also converged. Each of their separate paths are quite an extraordinary tale on their own. But together, they can have as big as an impact as Tommy and Nancy Lincoln, parents of Abraham Lincoln. Even if it's just a bloop in the water. I didn't do that right. Bloop. Those many ripples can change the lives of many and help them to overcome. More seeds, more multiplication, more potential disciples. Thank you, Joe and Karen. Thank you, Jason and Tammy. All of these examples I've described display something important regarding making disciples. Intentionality. They all intentionally decided to go, make disciples, baptize, and teach, which is exactly what Jesus says in the Great Commission. Discipleship must be intentional. I know convergence of paths may seem accidental or coincidental, but nothing is really accidental or coincidental when it comes to God. Making disciples is an ongoing, multi-step process that begins with reaching out or evangelizing and ends with releasing disciples to go and do the same, intentional multiplication. Sometimes in our zeal and passion to make a difference, we omit, we overlook, we leave out, or we neglect. We commit the great omission. We miss the forest for the trees. It's easy to do. We all do it. I probably did it this week. The results of making disciples is on display in this place. You see it on a weekly basis. With the Great Commission comes great responsibility, to borrow from Spider-Man. One of those responsibilities is to simply open our eyes and see. Otherwise, it's just too easy to omit, leave out, neglect, and overlook, to miss the forest for the trees, to commit the great omission. Making disciples of all nations may indeed mean going across the world. It can mean going across the country, across the state, or across town. It can even mean going across the street, across your neighbor's fence, or across your kitchen table, parents. It might also be reaching out to the person sitting near you today, in front of you or behind you. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't commit the great omission. Finally, remember this. Making disciples is an ongoing journey. It's a process. It's intentional, and it's a long-term commitment. Question. When Jesus invited Peter and his brothers to follow him, did they drop their fishing gear, step out of the boat, and immediately become full-fledged disciples? They were followers at that point, but they had to go on a journey with Jesus. Even though they were followers of Jesus, they were just beginning. The journey was long. It was a process. So then what does disciple mean? It means follower, a learner, someone who adheres to the teachings of another. Specifically, a disciple of Jesus is a worshiper, a servant, and a witness. And that witness part is the most important part. Disciples make more disciples, etc., etc. Witnessing is what it's all about. So when did these men become full-fledged disciples and apostles? Just before Jesus ascended and he released them with the Great Commission. Now there's a lot of discussion among biblical scholars, which I am definitely not one of, At that point, we can call them apostles, one who is sent. That's what Jesus did. He sent them. And there's a lot of disagreement among biblical scholars as to whether or not they were the one and only group of true apostles. And that may be so. I'm not going to get into that. The Great Commission commands us to make disciples. That's all we need to be concerned about here. Now, a dose of reality. Of the 12 original disciples Jesus asked to follow him, how many of them remained disciples? There's 11. One didn't make the entire journey. He chose a different path. He took a wrong turn. He did not graduate. Be aware that while the Great Commission is an honorable endeavor and an immense responsibility, it does not carry with it a guarantee. There are bound to be some disappointments. Ask Pastor Tom and ask Pastor Joseph. It isn't always successful. Doesn't mean they weren't honorable in their effort, but sometimes it doesn't take. Some of the seeds don't make it. That's just a fact of the situation. We're no different than Jesus in that respect. One of them did not make it. Yes, he had some prophecy to fulfill in betraying Jesus, but he didn't make it. Jesus did not commit the Great Omission. He did not omit, overlook, leave out, or neglect. He reached out across the water's edge to some fishermen. He reached out to a despised tax collector. Those he chose as his disciples were not vetted like potential cabinet members. They were not subject to a confirmation hearing. They were not captains of industry or men of great wealth and notoriety. They weren't highly decorated or highly educated. They possessed no degrees or credentials. And they had never been the subject of a single news headline. Nope. Jesus called the average Joe, the man on the street. He called someone like you and like me, like all of us. He sowed seeds. He watered and cared for them. He enriched and nourished them with his teaching. He baptized them and made them disciples. There are many disciples here today, more than I mentioned. There are also many disciples in the making. Are you one? Don't omit yourself. No, don't neglect yourself. Don't leave yourself out. Don't dismiss the possibilities. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't commit the Great Omission. Amen.